U.S. Customs and Border Protection is responsible for all of the goods and people flowing across our borders. It's no exaggeration to say the person in charge of this vast agency is tasked with protecting our country and our economy. That is certainly a tall order. And unfortunately, after careful review of his background and qualifications, I can firmly say that the evidence shows that Mr. Scott falls short. In my view, he is unfit and unqualified to be CBP Commissioner. He has no experience with customs facilitation or enforcement. Donald Trump is creating the biggest disruptions to the U.S. customs system that I have seen in my time in public service. And he's prepared to leave it in the hands of somebody who has no experience with customs. The head of CBP will also be in charge of limiting the impact of Trump's disastrous tariffs on supply chains and workers. If goods crossing the border get backed up or delayed, that can make or break small businesses in my home state that rely on these goods. Oregon is overwhelmingly a small business state. When you go at it, you can probably count the number of big businesses on both hands. We're a small business state, and small businesses are getting hammered by these tariff policies. Nothing I've seen in Mr. Scott's background shows me he is prepared to meet the challenges I've described. He also has a long history of problematic leadership and judgment. Perhaps the most egregious example is his involvement in the cover-up of a homicide of a migrant detained while Mr. Scott was leading the Border Patrol office in San Diego. In 2010, a migrant by the name of Mr. Rojas was detained after crossing the border. He was then beaten by CBP agents and eventually died as a direct result of his injuries. As the guy in charge, the question then becomes, what did Mr. Scott do? First, he didn't follow his own agency's policies. He didn't immediately refer the incident to outside investigators. Instead, the office he led started its own investigation into Mr. Rojas's death. A former CBP internal affairs official told us that the investigation was, quote, not an investigation, it was a cover-up, one Mr. Scott supervised, unquote. An independent Human Rights Commission ruled a few weeks ago that the U.S. government violated human rights principles in the cover-up of Mr. Rojas's death. Fast forward to the summer of 2020 when the Trump administration deployed a staggering number of federal law enforcement officials in my hometown of Portland to suppress peaceful protests. He was serving as chief of Border Patrol at that time. And at that time, they provided vast support for the deployment of federal law enforcement officers that whisked peaceful protesters away in unmarked vehicles, shot protesters in the head, and unleashed chemical weapons and contaminants. Now in his second term, Donald Trump seems eager to use every tool at his disposal to weaponize the federal government against groups and individuals that disagree with him or attempt to push back on his agenda. Now in his second term, Donald Trump seems eager to use each tool at his disposal to weaponize the federal government against groups and individuals that disagree with him or attempt to push back on his agenda. The person in charge of our borders has to be somebody that is able and willing to push back on the worst impulses and directives of Donald Trump. We don't need to question what Mr. Scott would do if given a questionable order from Donald Trump, because we already know. He has a history of covering up the truth when it benefits him and a willingness to enable Donald Trump's worst impulses to target American citizens exercising their constitutional rights. Again, I want to come back to the proposition that Customs and Border Patrol, and I think this is well understood on both sides of the aisle, that at the helm of this critical agency, you need somebody who's going to prioritize protecting American families and facilitating trade that benefits American businesses. And you need a commissioner who's going to crack down on fentanyl smuggling and human trafficking. We know that law enforcement can make a difference. We've seen evidence of that in my home state just recently. We need a person who's going to not be preoccupied with doing the political bidding of the president, but to focus on the kind of agenda that taps the skills and experience to make sure that we wring every bit of benefit out of Customs and Border Patrol, a critical agency. For all of these reasons, I can't support Mr. Scott's nomination, and I'm going to urge my colleagues now to vote no, and we'll continue to urge that as we go forward.